The river ran black as spilled ink beneath a sky with no moon, and Elspeth Farrow walked toward it alone, the way she did every night that summer, because there was no one else to send and no one else who would go. She carried 2 wooden pails on a yoke across her shoulders, and the rope had worn a groove into her collarbone that she had stopped noticing months ago. The well behind her grandmother's cottage had turned brackish in the drought, thick with the taste of iron and rot, and the physician had warned that another mouthful of it might finish what the fever had already begun in the old woman's lungs. So Elspeth went to the river instead, in the deepest part of the night, when no one from the village would see a gentleman's granddaughter reduced to hauling water like a common washerwoman. She had not always feared being seen. There had been a time, before her father's debts and her mother's death, and the slow unravelling of everything her family once was, when Elspeth Farrow would have walked to that river in daylight with her chin high and dared anyone to pity her. But pride was a luxury for those who had somewhere to fall from, and she had already fallen as far as a woman of her birth could fall without disappearing entirely. So she went at night, and she told herself the darkness was a mercy, not a shame, and most nights she almost believed it. She did not know, that first evening in late June, that she was not alone at the river at all. He stood beneath the black shadow of an alder tree, some 30 paces upstream, dressed in a coat too plain for a man of his bearing, and boots too fine for a man of his coat, and he watched her set down her pails with the particular carefulness of someone who had learned that carelessness cost money she did not have. He watched her kneel at the water's edge, gather her skirts with one hand, and dip the first pail with the other, her movements so practiced and so quiet that he understood at once this was not her first night doing this, nor would it be her last. He did not announce himself. He told himself, standing there in the dark with his heart doing something strange and unfamiliar in his chest, that he was only observing, as he had come to this county to observe. As he had promised himself he would observe every soul on his late father's lands before he trusted a single one of them again. But even as he thought it, he knew it was already more than observation. He had followed her from the lane without deciding to follow her. His feet had simply gone where she went, the way water finds the lowest point of a valley without being towed to. His name was Julian Ashworth, Duke of Alderly, though no one in Hollowmead knew that yet, and he intended to keep it that way for as long as he possibly could. He had arrived in the village 3 weeks earlier under the plain name of Mr. Grey, claiming to be a land agent sent ahead of the new Duke to assess the condition of the tenant farms before His Grace took up residence at Alderley Hall. It was not entirely a lie. He was after all assessing the condition of his own lands, and he had every intention of taking up residence there eventually, once he had learned what he needed to learn. What he had not told anyone was that the new Duke and the land agent were the same man, and that the reason for the deception sat in his chest like a stone he had been carrying since the spring. Since the morning he had discovered that the woman he had nearly married cared a great deal for the title of Duchess, and rather less for the man who would give it to her. Her name had been Camilla Vane, and she had wept prettily when he ended the engagement, and 3 weeks later she had accepted an offer from his own cousin Reginald, who stood to inherit everything Julian possessed if Julian died without an heir, and who had apparently decided that marrying well was a faster route to fortune than waiting patiently for his cousin's death. Julian did not think Reginald capable of hastening that death directly. He was not certain of it either, and the uncertainty had followed him out of London like a shadow that would not lie flat. So he had come north to his own estate as a stranger, determined to learn the truth of the people who depended on him, before he let any of them close enough to matter. He had expected to find greed. He had expected flattery, calculation, the particular hunger of people who scented a fortune nearby and meant to have some of it. He had not expected a girl in a patched grey cloak, hauling river water alone in the dark, because she was too proud to let her neighbours see her do it. He watched her fill the second pail and rise, wincing slightly as the yoke settled back across her shoulders. And something in him that had gone hard and closed since March opened, just a little, without his permission. She did not see him that first night, and he let her go without a word, and he told himself that was the end of it. It was not the end of it. It was, though neither of them yet understood this, only the beginning. He returned to the river the following night, and the night after that, always at the same hour, always beneath the same alder tree, and always he told himself he was merely continuing his observations, gathering the truth of Hollowmead one small honest fact at a time. On the fourth night, a stone shifted beneath his boot as he came closer than he meant to, and the sound cracked through the darkness like a struck match. Elspeth spun with the empty pail raised like a weapon, her heart slamming so hard she could feel it in her throat. "Who is there?" "Forgive me." He stepped out from the shadow of the tree with his hands open and empty, showing her he meant no harm, though every instinct in her still screamed to run. "I did not mean to frighten you. I was walking, and heard you at the water." "Walking," she repeated, unconvinced, her eyes narrowing at him through the dark. "At this hour. Alone, and in these woods, where a man might come to harm himself against a tree root, or a woman might come to harm herself against a stranger. You have a low opinion of strangers." "I have an accurate one," she said, and did not lower the pail. "State your business, sir, or continue your walking elsewhere." He almost smiled. It had been a long while since anyone had spoken to him without the particular softness people used for men of unknown fortune who might yet prove useful. "My business is honest, I assure you. I am newly come to the district. My name is Grey. I am seeing to some matters for the estate at Alderly, before the new Duke arrives to take up his inheritance." The new Duke. Something flickered across her face, quick and gone, that he could not quite read in the dark. "And has the estate set you to counting the water in its rivers now, along with its rents?" "I confess the river is not on my ledger." "You are, rather. I have seen you here 3 nights running, and I began to wonder if you required assistance, or protection, or simply to be left in peace, and I could not decide which. So I am asking." She studied him a long moment, this stranger with the plain coat, and the voice that did not quite match it. A voice too smooth, too carefully unhurried, as though it had been trained somewhere to sound like nothing in particular. She should have been afraid of him. Instead, absurdly, she found herself more curious than afraid, and curiosity had gotten her into trouble before. "I require none of those things," she said at last. "I require only to fill my pails and return home before my grandmother wakes and finds herself alone. If you mean to walk here again, Mr. Grey, I would ask that you announce yourself sooner next time, so that I am not obliged to strike you with a bucket." "A fair arrangement," he said, and this time he did smile, and it transformed his face so entirely that she felt something small and unwelcome turn over in her chest. "I shall whistle from now on. So you know it is only me, and not a bear come down from the fells. We have no bears in Hollowmead. Then you have nothing at all to fear from me," he said, "which I hope you will come to believe, in time." She did not answer that. She filled her second pail, settled the yoke across her shoulders, and walked past him into the dark without another word. And he stood beneath the alder tree and watched her go and felt, for the first time since March, something in his chest that was not suspicion. He did not know her name yet. He found that he wanted to. It took another 4 nights before she told him, and only because he was persistent in the quiet, patient way of a man used to waiting for things he wanted, and because she discovered, somewhat to her own alarm, that she was beginning to look forward to the sound of his low whistle in the dark. "Elspeth," she said finally, kneeling at the water's edge while he stood a respectful distance away, no longer beneath the tree but closer now, near enough that they could speak without raising their voices above the river's murmur. Elspeth Farrow. Farrow. He turned the name over as though testing its weight. I do not believe I have seen that name on the estate rolls. You would not have. My grandmother holds no land from the Duke. She holds only her cottage, and that by the good grace of the previous Duke's steward, who was a kinder man than his successor is like to be, if the rumours of the new Duke's temperament are to be believed. He felt something cold move through him. What rumours are those? That he is proud and cold, and was nearly married to a woman who cared only for his title, which soured him on the whole business of feeling anything for anyone. That he means to raise the rents on every tenant within the year, to recover what her family cost him in gifts and settlements before the engagement broke. That he has sent this Mr. Grey ahead of him to find out which tenants are worth keeping, and which might be turned off the land without too much noise. She glanced up at him, her expression unreadable in the dark. Is that true, Mr. Grey? Is that your true business here? He was quiet a moment too long before he answered, and he hated himself for it. I have been sent to learn the truth of the tenants, he said carefully, and to report it honestly. I cannot speak to what the Duke intends to do with what I find. I have not met the man well enough to say. It was, he told himself, not entirely a lie. Well, she rose, lifting her pails. I hope, for all our sakes, that you find us worth keeping. I have found, he said, before he could stop himself, that you at least are worth a great deal more than that. She stopped, the pails swinging gently on their yoke, and looked at him for a long moment in the dark, and he could not tell if what crossed her face was pleasure or alarm, or some tangled thing that was both at once. You should not say such things to a woman you have known 4 nights, Mr. Grey. No, he agreed. I should not. And yet I find I have said it, and I do not think I shall take it back. She left without answering, but she was smiling, he thought, just before she turned, and he carried the memory of that smile back to the cold, half-furnished rooms he had taken above the village inn, and did not sleep well, and did not particularly mind. Over the following weeks, the river became something neither of them named aloud, but both of them understood. He learned that her grandmother, Margaret Farrow, had been gently born, and had married for love against her family's wishes, and had paid for that love with a life of narrowing circumstances that ended, as such lives so often did, in a small cottage, and a great deal of pride, and very little money. He learned that Elspeth's father had died 3 years past, leaving debts that consumed what remained of the family's modest fortune, and that her mother had followed him into the churchyard the winter after, worn down by grief and hardship, in roughly equal measure. He learned that Elspeth took in fine needlework for the wives of the local gentry to keep herself and her grandmother fed, that she walked 4 miles each way to deliver it because they could not keep a horse, that she had not owned a new gown in 2 years, and did not appear to mind, or if she minded, did not permit herself to say so. She learned in turn that Mr. Grey read a great deal for a land agent, and spoke 4 languages when he forgot himself, and once corrected a point of law regarding tenant rights, with an authority that seemed strange in a man of his supposed station. She learned that he asked questions about her the way other men asked questions about the weather, constantly, as though the answers mattered to him beyond simple curiosity. She learned that when she spoke of her grandmother's failing health, his face changed in a way that suggested that trouble had become, somehow, his trouble too. She did not know, could not have known, that Julian Ashworth had begun to dread the day he would have to tell her the truth, because he had come to understand, with a clarity that frightened him more than any ledger of debts ever could, that he was no longer testing the honesty of Hollowmead. He was falling in love with one particular soul within it, and every day he delayed his confession was a day he stole from her without her consent, and he told himself each night that tomorrow he would tell her. and each night he found some reason not to, because he could not bear the thought of the warmth in her eyes, turning to something else, when she learned what he had let her believe. It was on a warm night in late July, with the river running low and slow beside them, that she nearly caught him in it. "You move like a man used to giving orders," she said, watching him lift her filled pails without asking, as he had taken to doing, though she had told him more than once that she was quite capable of carrying her own water. "You stand like one too. I have wondered, more than once, whether Mr. Grey is entirely the whole of your name, or only the part you have chosen to share." His heart lurched. "What do you mean?" "I mean that land agents do not generally speak Italian to themselves when they think no one is listening, nor do they generally know the difference between a Gainsborough and a lesser hand at 40 paces, as you did last week when we passed the vicar's parlour window, and you remarked upon his new portrait before either of us had properly seen it." She tilted her head, studying him with the frank, unflinching curiosity that he had come to treasure, and now, suddenly, feared. "Who are you truly, Mr. Grey?" He stood very still, the pails heavy in his hands, and for one long moment he considered telling her everything. The words rose in his throat, ready. "My name is Julian Ashworth. I am the Duke of Alderly. I have deceived you for 6 weeks, and I did not mean to, and then I meant to stop, and could not find the courage, and I am asking you now, very late and very badly, to forgive me for it. I am a man," he said instead, and hated himself even as he said it, "who has seen a great deal of the world, and learned a great many things in it, and who finds that none of those things matter half so much to him as the woman standing in front of him at this river." It was true, every word of it, and it was also, he knew, a coward's answer, a way of telling her something real in order to avoid telling her the one true thing that mattered most. She looked at him a moment longer, and whatever she saw in his face seemed to satisfy some part of her and trouble another part, because she did not press him further, only took her pails back from his hands and said, more quietly than before, "You are a strange sort of land agent, Mr. Grey. I hope, whatever you are, that you are at least a kind one." "I hope so too," he said, and the words came out rougher than he intended, thick with a guilt she could not have understood the shape of. He resolved, walking back to the inn that night beneath a sky just beginning to pale toward dawn, that he would tell her the truth before the month was out. He did not yet know that the month would not give him the chance to choose the moment himself. The letter arrived 3 days later, carried up from London by a rider who had worn out 2 horses getting there, and it bore his cousin Reginald's seal, and it said, in Reginald's careless, confident hand, that the arrangements for the autumn house party at Alderley Hall were proceeding apace, and that Miss Vane's family had been invited along with half the county's eligible daughters, and that surely it was time for the Duke to end his little sojourn in the north, and come home to attend to matters of far greater consequence than tenant rolls and drainage ditches. Reginald's letter was, Julian understood as he read it twice through, a warning as much as an invitation. His cousin had learned of his absence, had perhaps guessed at some of its purpose, and was moving now to remind him that a duke's duty lay in London ballrooms and marriage negotiations, not in the muddy lanes of a village most of the ton could not locate on a map. There was a threat folded into the letter's polite phrases, subtle, but unmistakable to a man who had spent his life learning to read the true meaning beneath his family's pleasantries. If Julian did not return soon to manage his own affairs, Reginald would be glad to manage them for him, in whatever manner he saw fit. And there was worse. Reginald's letter mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he had heard reports from the estate steward regarding a cottage on the northern boundary of the village, tenanted by a widow of no particular means, whose lease he understood to be badly in arrears, and whose land might be more profitably let to a farmer with capital enough to improve it. He suggested, in the mildest possible language, that the Duke's new agent might see to clearing the matter up before the family returned to town. Julian read that paragraph 4 times before the meaning fully settled into him. Cold and sickening. Reginald meant Margaret Farrow's cottage. He meant Elspeth's home. He understood, in that moment, 2 things with equal and terrible clarity. The first was that his cousin, whether by design or simple careless cruelty, was preparing to turn an old ailing woman and her granddaughter out of the only home they had left, in order to line an estate that did not even belong to him with a slightly larger rent. The second was that Julian himself, as Duke, had the power to stop it with a single word. A power he had been hiding from the one person who most needed to know he possessed it. He went to the river that night with the letter still folded in his coat pocket, and he found her already there, kneeling at the water's edge in the pale wash of a rising moon. And he understood, watching her, that the time for careful confessions and chosen moments had run out. Reginald would act quickly. Julian would have to act more quickly still, and he could not do it as Mr. Grey, Elspeth. His voice came out rougher than he intended. And she looked up at once, some note in it warning her before he said another word. "What is it?" "What has happened?" "I must tell you something," he said, "and I am afraid, when I have told it, that you will not wish to see me again. And I find that thought harder to bear than I expected it to be, given that I have only known you 2 months. She set down her pail slowly, rising, her eyes fixed on his face with a wariness that cut him more than any anger would have. "Then tell me quickly, Mr. Grey, and let us be done with the suspense of it, whatever it costs. My name is not Grey." The words came out plain and unadorned, stripped of every careful phrase he had rehearsed on the walk from the inn. "My name is Julian Ashworth. I am the Duke of Alderly. I have been the Duke since my father's death 8 months ago, and I came here under a false name, because I no longer trusted my own judgment of people who might value my title above the man beneath it. And I told myself I was testing the honesty of my tenants, and instead I found you, and I did not have the courage to tell you the truth before now, and I am telling you now because there is no more time left to wait for courage to arrive on its own." The silence that followed felt to him like the drop of a blade. She did not speak at once. She stood very still at the water's edge, the moon silvering the loose strands of hair that had escaped her braid, and he watched something move across her face that he could not name. Shock and hurt and a fierce sudden anger all tangled together. "You are the Duke," she said finally, very quietly. "The proud, cold Duke of the rumours. The man whose steward means to raise our rents and turn off tenants he judges unworthy of the land. I have raised no rents. I have turned off no one. I came here to learn the truth before I did anything of the kind, because I did not want to be the sort of man who governs from a distance and never sees the faces his decisions fall upon. And instead, you governed from a lie." Her voice shook now, not with sorrow but with something harder. "You let me speak freely to you, Julian Ashworth, Duke of Alderly. You let me complain of the new Duke's coldness to his own face and say nothing. You let me tell you things about my grandmother, my family, my fears, my hopes, believing I spoke to a land agent of no particular consequence, a man whose good opinion could not touch my life one way or the other, and all the while you were the very man whose good opinion controls whether we keep our home or lose it. Do you understand what you have done? You have made a fool of me for your own amusement, not for amusement. Never that." "Elspeth, do not," she said, stepping back from him. "Call me that in that voice. As though nothing between us has changed, when everything has. I do not know which parts of you were real, and which were performance. I do not know if the man who stood at this river and told me I was worth more than his good report was Julian Ashworth speaking his heart, or the Duke of Alderly testing how far a poor woman might be led by flattery before she forgot herself entirely. Every word I've said to you at this river was true. I swear it to you on whatever honor I have left. Your honor, she said, with a bitterness that struck him like a physical blow, has just spent 2 months lying to me beneath an alder tree. Forgive me if I do not accept its oath so easily. She bent and lifted her pails, her hands trembling badly enough that the water sloshed over the rims. I must go home. My grandmother's cottage, I am told, is under some threat from your family, your grace, though I confess I do not yet understand the whole of it, and I find I have not the strength tonight to hear it from you. Elspeth, please, there is a threat, and it is grave, and I came here tonight in part to warn you of it, because I intend to stop it. And I need you to understand that whatever else you believe of me, that much at least is true. I will hear it tomorrow, she said, from someone other than you, if that can be arranged. Good night, your grace. And she walked away from him into the dark without a backward glance, leaving him standing alone at the water's edge, with Reginald's letter still folded against his chest like a second. Colder heart. He did not sleep that night. He spent it instead at the small writing desk in his rooms above the inn, drafting and discarding letter after letter, first to his London solicitor instructing him to secure Margaret Farrow's lease in perpetuity, and forgive whatever arrears the estate's steward claimed existed. Then to the steward himself demanding a full accounting of who had authorized any threat against the cottage in the first place, and finally, though he tore this one up twice before deciding to send it, to Reginald, informing his cousin in terms that admitted no misunderstanding that any further interference in the tenancy of Hollowmead, or any attempt to manage the Duke's estate in the Duke's absence, would be met with consequences Reginald would not enjoy discovering. By morning he had learned, through a hastily summoned meeting with his own steward, a man named Holloway, who had clearly been operating under the belief that Reginald's letters carried the Duke's authority, that the threat against the Farrow cottage was real, and had already progressed further than Julian had feared. Holloway, flustered and apologetic once he understood his error, admitted that he had received instructions. He had believed them to come with the family's blessing, to inform Mrs. Farrow within the week that her lease would not be renewed at Michaelmas, and that the land would instead be let to a Mr. Josiah Pruitt, a local moneylender of considerable means and considerably less scruple, who had already made inquiries about the property, and had, Holloway confessed with visible discomfort, mentioned that Mrs. Farrow's late husband had owed him a small debt some years past, that had never been fully settled. A debt he seemed eager to collect in land, now that its original debtor was long dead, and the interest, by his own dubious reckoning, had compounded into a sum far exceeding the cottage's worth. Julian felt something cold and furious settle over him as the picture assembled itself. Reginald had not acted alone. He had found in Pruitt a local instrument willing to manufacture a debt into a dispossession, and had used the Duke's absence and the confusion of a new administration to let it proceed unchallenged, all so that a piece of unremarkable land might be handed to a man who would pay handsomely for the privilege, with the profit, no doubt, finding its way eventually into Reginald's own pocket through whatever arrangement. The two men had struck. "You will inform Mr. Pruitt," Julian said to Holloway, in a voice that made the older man straighten as though a very different person had suddenly occupied the room, "that any debt he claims against the Farrow family must be produced in writing, with proof of its origin and every payment made against it, before this office will recognize a farthing of it as owed. You will further inform him that the cottage and its land are to remain in Mrs. Farrow's tenancy at the current rent for as long as she or any heir of her choosing wishes to hold it, by direct order of the Duke of Alderly, and that any attempt to remove her by force or by fraud will be treated as a matter for the magistrate." "Yes, your grace." Holloway hesitated. "And might I ask, the letters that went out under Mr. Ashworth's authority, your cousin's letters, shall I write to him as well, informing him of your instructions?" "I will write to my cousin myself," Julian said grimly. "He and I have a great deal to discuss." He did write to Reginald that same afternoon, a letter considerably shorter and considerably colder than any he had sent his cousin before, informing him in plain terms that the Duke's estate was the Duke's to manage, that his continued interference in matters he had no authority over would result in a formal severance of whatever allowance and courtesy Julian had, until now extended to him as family, and that the autumn house party, along with any hopes Reginald harboured of manoeuvring his cousin into a hasty marriage arranged for, the family's convenience rather than the Duke's own choosing, would proceed only with Julian's express consent, which at present he had no intention of giving. It was, he reflected as he sealed the letter, the first time in 8 months as Duke that he had used the full weight of his title for something that mattered more to him than his own pride. It felt, strangely, less like power and more like penance. He did not go to the river that night, uncertain of his welcome, and instead sent word through the innkeeper's daughter that Mrs. Farrow's lease was secure and the threat against her cottage entirely withdrawn, without saying by whose hand the matter had been resolved, wanting Elspeth to have that relief at least without the complication of his presence attached to it. 3 days passed in which he did not see her at all. He told himself he was giving her the space her anger demanded, and told himself, too less comfortably, that he was afraid of what he would find in her face if he went to her now. Confirmation that the trust between them had broken past mending, that the weeks at the river had been, in the end, a kindness she would rather forget than forgive. On the 4th day, she came to Alderly Hall herself. He was in the estate office reviewing rent rolls with Halloway when the footman announced, with barely concealed astonishment, that a Miss Farrow had arrived and requested to speak with the Duke directly, and would not be turned away by any lesser member of the household. Julian rose so quickly he nearly upset the inkwell, and told Holloway to leave them, and stood waiting with his heart hammering as though he were a boy of 20, rather than a man of 30 facing the woman he loved. She entered dressed in her plainest gown, chin lifted in the manner he had come to recognize as her particular armor against a world that had given her little cause to trust it, and she stopped a careful distance from him, close enough to speak without raising her voice, far enough to make clear she had not come to fall into his arms. "I am told," she said, "that the threat against my grandmother's cottage has been withdrawn, and the lease secured, by order of the Duke. I have come to thank you for it, since it seems only proper. Whatever else stands unresolved between us. You owe me no thanks. The threat should never have existed. My cousin acted without my knowledge or consent, in a manner I intend to see is never repeated, and I am only sorry it reached as far as it did before I learned of it and could stop it. I do not think," she said carefully, "that gratitude and forgiveness are the same thing, Your Grace, and I find I am able to offer you one without yet being able to offer the other. I understand that. I would not ask it of you before you were ready to give it honestly, even if that meant never." He drew a slow breath, steadying himself. "I have thought of little else these 3 days but what I would say to you, if you gave me the chance to say it, and now that you are here, I find every rehearsed word has abandoned me entirely. So I will simply tell you the truth plainly, and let you judge it as you will. I did not come to this county to find a wife. I came to escape one who had never truly wanted me at all, only what I could give her, and I came determined to trust no one until I had tested them thoroughly enough to be certain. I did not expect, in a village I chose almost at random, to find a woman whose honesty and courage put every calculating heart I had known in London entirely to shame. I did not expect to fall in love with her at a riverbank in the dark, carrying pails of water she was too proud to be seen carrying by daylight. And when I understood that I had, I found myself unable to tell her the truth, not because I wished to deceive her further, but because I could not bear to lose what had grown between us before either of us was ready to test whether it could survive my true name attached to it. And has it? Her voice was unsteady now, all the careful armor beginning to crack. Survived, I mean. Can it survive, knowing what you let me believe, and for how long? I do not know, he admitted. I know only that I have never wanted anything so much as I want the chance to find out, and that whatever you decide, I will not use my title or my position to press you toward an answer you do not freely choose. If you tell me now that you cannot forgive the deception, I will accept it. And I will still see to it that your grandmother's home is safe for as long as she lives, because that was never a bargain struck for your affection. It was simply right, and I should have made certain of it the moment I understood the danger, title or no title, feelings or none. She was quiet a long while, studying him with an intensity that made him feel, not for the first time, entirely transparent before her. You are the second man to lie to me about who he was, she said finally. My father spent the last years of his life pretending to my mother, and to me that our fortunes were sound, until the truth arrived all at once, and destroyed us with the shock of it as much as the debt itself. I have spent 3 years since learning to trust nothing that is not proven to me slowly, in daylight, with no shadows left in it. You are asking me to trust a man who courted me for 2 months, from behind a false name, in the dark, at a river where no one could see us, and I find I do not know how to answer that, even though some very foolish part of my heart already has. Then let me court you again, he said in daylight, under my own name, in full view of anyone who cares to watch, for as long as it takes you to trust what you see. I am not asking you to forgive the deception today. I am asking you to allow me the chance to earn back what it cost, honestly this time, with nothing hidden between us. Something in her face softened, just slightly. Though her eyes were bright with unshed tears, she seemed determined not to let fall in front of him. That, she said, I believe I can allow. It was not a declaration of love returned, not yet, but it was a door left open rather than closed, and Julian Ashworth, Duke of Alderly, found it was the sweetest mercy he had been offered in a very long while. The courting that followed was unlike anything either of them had known before, conducted almost entirely in the bright, unforgiving light of a village that had suddenly discovered its mysterious land agent was in truth its long-absent duke, and that he had apparently developed a marked preference for the company of Margaret Farrow's granddaughter, a fact that travelled through Hollowmead with the speed such facts always travelled through small communities starved for genuine drama. He called at the cottage properly, with his carriage and his own name announced at the door, and sat with Margaret Farrow through long afternoons, discussing everything from the state of the roads to the old woman's memories of a London season 50 years gone. Memories that reminded him, achingly, of exactly the kind of world Elspeth had been born to and denied by circumstance. He walked with Elspeth through the village in full daylight, enduring the stares and whispers of neighbours who could not quite believe the Duke himself walked openly with a woman who mended other men's linen for her bread, and he made certain, in every gesture, that those stares understood he was not ashamed to be seen, whatever they thought of the match. The village itself took longer to settle than either of them expected. In the first days after the truth became known, Elspeth found she could not walk to the baker's or the draper's without feeling every eye in Hollowmead turned toward her, weighing her, wondering aloud in voices not quite low enough what a duke could possibly want with a seamstress who mended other women's petticoats for her bread. Mrs. Cobb, who kept the dry goods shop and had known Elspeth since she was a child small enough to be lifted onto the counter for a sweet, looked at her now with a strange, assessing coolness, as though trying to decide whether the girl she had once pitied had all along been playing some longer and cleverer game than anyone credited her for. They think I contrived it, Elspeth told Julian one afternoon, more wounded by the suspicion than she wished to admit. They think I knew from the very first night who you were, and drew you to that river on purpose, and let you believe I did not know. all so that a duke might fall in love with what looked like innocence. I have spent my whole life being underestimated in this village, and now, in a single week, I am accused of being far too clever by half. I do not know which is worse. Neither is true, Julian said, and in time they will see that for themselves, once they watch how you conduct yourself, which is exactly as you have always conducted yourself, honestly, and without artifice, and without the smallest care for what a title might buy you. Gossip burns fast and dies faster, when it is given nothing true to feed on. He was right, though it took the better part of the autumn to prove it. What finally turned the village's suspicion to something warmer was not any grand gesture on Julian's part, but Elspeth's own steady refusal to change herself to suit either the gossips who doubted her or the fashionable acquaintances who began, cautiously, to court her favor now that her fortunes had so dramatically improved. She continued to sit with the vicar's ailing wife twice a week, as she always had. She continued to mend the miller's daughter's wedding linens at no charge, as she had promised months before any of it, refusing every attempt by the girl's mother to pay her now that she might easily afford to refuse the work altogether. When old Mrs. Cobb's shop nearly failed for want of custom that winter, it was Elspeth, not the Duke, who quietly arranged for the household at Alderly Hall to take its dry goods there exclusively, without ever mentioning to a soul that she had done it, until Holloway let it slip in an unguarded moment, and the whole village understood, at last, precisely what manner of duchess they were gaining. Not everyone in the county received the news with grace. Reginald, upon learning that his scheme with Pruitt had been discovered and dismantled, and that his cousin had not only refused the marriage to Miss Vane's circle he had been manoeuvring toward, but had apparently fallen in earnest love with a penniless seamstress from a village he had been sent to spy upon, arrived at Alderly Hall in a fury that did him no credit whatsoever. "You will make yourself a laughing-stock," he said, pacing the length of the library, while Julian watched him with a calm that only enraged him further. A duke, courting a woman who hauls river water for want of a decent well. What do you imagine society will say when you bring her to London? They will smile to your face and shred her to ribbons the moment your back is turned, and you will have thrown away every advantage your position affords for the sake of a pretty face and a fit of sentiment. "I have thrown away nothing," Julian said, "except perhaps my patience for hearing you speak of a woman worth 10 of anyone in your London circle, myself included on my worst days. I would remind you, Reginald, that it was you who arranged a false debt to steal an old woman's home for the sake of a moneylender's profit. And it is you standing in my library lecturing me on what does a family's honor credit. I think you would do well to reconsider which of us has more cause for shame." "You cannot marry her," Reginald said, his composure finally cracking. "The family will not stand for it. Your father would not have stood for it." "My father," Julian said quietly, "married my mother against considerable family objection, as I understand you well know, since you have used the story often enough to remind me of my own supposedly romantic nature, whenever it suited your arguments before. He found happiness in a match no one else approved of, and I find I intend to follow his example rather than your objections. You may attend the wedding, Reginald, or you may absent yourself from it, but you will not prevent it, and I would advise you to consider very carefully whether you wish to remain a welcome guest in this family at all, given what you have already attempted against it." Reginald left Alderly Hall that same afternoon, and did not return for many months, and whatever schemes he had once nursed toward his cousin's fortune withered, in the end, from lack of any further opportunity to pursue them. Elspeth heard of the confrontation second-hand, from Holloway, who reported it to her with poorly concealed satisfaction, and when Julian called at the cottage that evening she met him at the door with an expression he had not seen on her face before, something that looked almost like wonder. "You told your cousin," she said, "that I was worth 10 of anyone in his London circle. I told him the truth, Julian said. I find myself doing that rather often now. It is a habit I intend to keep, whatever it costs me in future family gatherings. She laughed then, a real laugh, unguarded and warm, the first he had heard from her since the night at the river, when everything had broken open between them. And something in his chest eased at the sound of it, as though a held breath had finally released. "Come inside," she said. "My grandmother has been asking after you. She says you tell better stories than the London gentleman she remembers, though I suspect she says that mainly to embarrass me. I would be glad to be embarrassing, if it means I am welcome," he said, and followed her in. Autumn came to Hollowmead slowly, the way it always did in that part of the country, the hedgerows turning gold before the trees committed to the change, and through those long golden weeks Julian and Elspeth built, in daylight this time, everything that had first taken root in the dark. He learned the small particulars of her that a man only learns through patience, that she hummed without noticing when she was concentrating over needlework, that she still flinched, very slightly, at any conversation that touched too closely on her father's failures, that she loved fiercely and without half measures once she allowed herself to love at all, and that having been so thoroughly starved of security in her young life, she trusted slowly, but once given, trusted completely. He told her in turn the fuller truth of what had driven him from London. Not merely Camilla Vane's calculation, though that had been the wound that finally forced him to act, but a lifetime of wondering whether anyone had ever wanted him for himself, given the accident of his birth that made such honest wanting nearly impossible to verify. He told her about his father's death, and the loneliness of inheriting a title before he felt ready to bear its weight, and the particular terror of arriving in a village determined to trust no one, only to find the one person who made him forget his own careful guardedness within the space of 4 nights at a riverbank. "I do not think," she told him one evening in October, sitting beside him on a bench in the small garden behind the cottage, while her grandmother dozed by the fire inside, "that I could have loved you so quickly if I had known from the first who you truly were. I would have been too busy guarding myself against your title to ever see the man beneath it. Perhaps the lie, whatever it cost us both, was the only way either of us could have found this honestly. That does not excuse it," he said. "I should have found the courage sooner." "No," she agreed. "You should have, and I have decided, after considerable thought, that I forgive you for not finding it sooner, provided you spend the rest of your life finding it easily from now on, in every matter, however small. That," he said, taking her hand in his, "is an easy bargain to keep when the alternative is losing you." The sternest test of all came in late October, when Julian could no longer avoid the harvest ball that Alderly Hall had hosted every year for 3 generations, and which the surrounding gentry would consider a grave insult if the new Duke failed to hold. He asked Elspeth to attend as his guest, not yet his betrothed in the eyes of the wider county, and she accepted, though she confessed to him the night before that she had not stood in a ballroom since she was a girl of 15, before her father's debts had closed every fine door in the county against her family, and that she feared she remembered less of its rules than the room would expect of her. "You need remember only one rule," Julian told her. "Stand as though you belong there, because you do, and let anyone who disputes it answer to me." It was, she would later admit, easier counsel to give than to follow. She entered the ballroom on his arm in a gown of soft blue silk that Julian had commissioned from the finest modiste in the county, though she had insisted on choosing the fabric and the trim herself, unwilling to be dressed like a doll for display, and the room fell into the particular hush that greets a scandal walking upright and unashamed into candlelight. Whispers followed her from the doorway to the refreshment table and back again, and though most of the county had by now heard some version of the truth, hearing a story and standing 3 feet from its heroine were, she discovered, very different trials. It was Camilla Vane, arrived that autumn as a guest of a cousin with land bordering Alderly's own, who delivered the evening's cruelest test. She approached Elspeth near the orangery doors with a smile so perfectly composed it might have been painted on, and said, just loudly enough for the nearest dozen guests to hear, that she thought it very brave of Miss Farrow to appear in society at all, given that everyone knew a duke's fondness for a pretty face rarely survived past the first winter, and that she, Camilla, spoke from some authority on the particular disappointments of Lovinger Ashworth. The room waited, hungry for Elspeth's humiliation, for tears or stammering, or a retreat to the ladies' withdrawing room that would confirm every unkind whisper as truth. Elspeth did none of those things. She looked at Camilla Vane with the calm, level gaze of a woman who had carried water alone through the dark for 3 years and feared very little that candlelight and gossip could do to her now, and said, in a voice that carried further than she perhaps intended, that she was grateful indeed for Miss Vane's authority on the subject of disappointing a duke, since she understood Miss Vane had considerably more practical experience of it than anyone else present, having disappointed 2 of them in fairly quick succession. A ripple of poorly stifled laughter moved through the nearest guests, and Camilla's composure cracked just enough to be visible before she withdrew toward the card-room without another word. Julian, who had crossed the floor the instant he saw Camilla approach, and arrived only in time to witness the end of the exchange, took Elspeth's hand and led her onto the floor as the musicians struck up a new set, and did not release it again for the remainder of the evening, dancing with her twice more than propriety strictly allowed, and making no secret whatsoever of his preference in front of the assembled county. "You did not need rescuing," he murmured, as they turned together beneath the chandeliers. "No," she agreed, with the ghost of a smile, "though I confess I am glad you came to stand beside me regardless. A woman need not require rescue to be glad of company while she gives as good as she gets." By the time the ball ended, the whispers that trailed Elspeth from the room had changed their character entirely, no longer wondering what a duke saw in a penniless seamstress, but wondering instead which unfortunate soul might next find themselves on the receiving end of her composure, and concluding, almost universally, that the Duke of Alderly had chosen rather better than half the ballroom had given him credit for. He proposed to her not at a grand ball, nor in the manicured gardens of Alderley Hall, but at the river itself, on a crisp evening in early November, when the water ran high and clear and cold beneath a sky finally generous enough to offer them a moon. At the exact spot beneath the alder tree where he had first watched her kneel to fill her pails, unaware that a stranger's heart was already, foolishly, hopelessly, beginning to belong to her. "I have brought you back to where it began," he said, "because I find I cannot separate the man I am now from the nights I spent here, learning to be worthy of you, badly at first, and I hope better since. I love you, Elspeth Farrow, not for your patience with my deception, nor for your grandmother's fine bloodline, nor for anything the world would consider a suitable reason for a duke to marry, but for your courage at carrying water alone in the dark rather than accept charity you had not earned, for your honesty even when it cost you dearly, and for the particular grace with which you have forgiven a man who did not entirely deserve it. I am asking you to marry me, not as the Duke of Alderly asking a favor of a grateful tenant, but as Julian, the man who followed you through the dark for reasons he could not explain, until his heart explained them for him, asking the woman he loves to spend the rest of her life beside him. In whatever light either of you chooses." She was crying by the time he finished, though she was laughing too, both at once, in the particular way of a heart too full to choose only one feeling. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Julian. I have been carrying that answer for weeks now, waiting only for you to ask it properly." He kissed her then, at last, beside the river that had first brought them together in the dark, and if any passing soul had happened by, they would have seen only a man and a woman in an ordinary embrace beneath an ordinary tree, and never guessed at the whole quiet history the water had witnessed to bring them there. They married the following spring, in the small stone chapel at Hollowmead, rather than the grand cathedral society expected of a duke, because Elspeth had asked for it, and Julian had refused nothing she asked of him, since the night he told her the truth. Margaret Farrow lived to see the wedding, seated in a place of honour near the front, weeping openly through the whole of the ceremony, and declaring afterward, to anyone who would listen, that she had always known her granddaughter was destined for something finer than the world had shown her, though she confessed she had never imagined quite how fine. The village that had once watched Elspeth walk to the river in shame now watched her ride from the chapel as its duchess. And if there was gossip in that change, it was gossip of admiration rather than scorn, for there was not a soul in Hollowmead who had not, at some point, benefited from the new duke's quiet insistence on fairness in every dealing with his tenants, an insistence Elspeth herself, once duchess, made certain never wavered. Years later, when their own children were old enough to ask how their parents had met, Julian would tell the story simply, leaving out none of his own folly and none of Elspeth's courage, ending it always the same way. "I followed her every step that summer," he would say, "though she never once knew it, until the night I could no longer bear to hide. And I have followed her gladly every step since, and I intend to follow her every step still to come, wherever the road may lead us, because I learned, at a dark riverbank many years ago, that the truest wealth a man can find is not a title nor a fortune, but a woman brave enough to carry her own burdens honestly, and generous enough in the end to let him carry them with her." And Elspeth, hearing it told so many times over so many years, never once tired of the ending, because it was, she knew better than anyone, entirely and gratefully true. Sometimes, on warm evenings when the children had been put to bed and the great house had settled into its familiar quiet, she and Julian would walk down together to the river that ran along the eastern boundary of the estate. Not the same water that had carried her pails so many years before, but close enough in sound and shadow to call the old memory home. They rarely spoke much on those walks. There was no longer any need to fill the silence with careful words, no lie to confess nor forgiveness to negotiate, only the easy settled comfort of two people who had found each other honestly in the end, however crooked the path that led them there. She would think, on those evenings, of the girl she had been, kneeling alone at a black river in the dark, too proud to let her poverty be seen by daylight, never once imagining that a stranger's quiet footsteps in the shadows behind her were the first steps of the only fortune that would ever truly matter. She did not regret the hardship that had shaped her, though she would not have wished it on any soul she loved, because it had taught her the one lesson no title could have given her on its own, that dignity was not something bestowed by rank or fortune, but something a person carried within themselves, through every dark and difficult mile, until at last, if they were fortunate, someone worthy came along, who could see it shining even in the deepest dark, and loved them for it before he ever knew their name.